My father said you needed a wife. The words were a whisper, barely disturbing the hot, still air of the high prairie. They came from a young woman who looked as if a strong gust of wind might carry her away. She was small and fine-boned, lost inside a tattered white prairie dress, its hem and sleeves frayed and stained with the dust of a long road. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes, dark and clear, held a startling composure. She could not have been more than 18. She stood in the hard-packed dirt of his yard, a small, cloth-wrapped bundle at her feet, and addressed the man on the porch as if she were commenting on the weather. The man, Cole, did not move. He was lean and weathered, his face a map of sun and silence, a gun belt resting low on his hips with the ease of a man who considered it part of his own skin. Beside him, a large German shepherd rose to its feet, a low rumble starting in its chest. The man placed a hand on the dog's head, and the sound ceased. He looked from the girl to the vast, empty horizon behind her, as if searching for the rest of a lost party. There was no one. Just the shimmering heat and the endless, aching blue of the sky. He had not spoken to another soul in 6 weeks, not since his last trip to town for salt and flour. The solitude was a garment he had tailored for himself, and this girl, with her impossible pronouncement, was a tear in the fabric. He finally looked back at her, his gaze sweeping over her worn dress, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the sheer unlikelihood of her presence. "Your father said that." His voice was rough, like stones scraping together, a sound unused to forming words. She gave a single, small nod. "He said you were a good man, but a lonely one. He said a man cannot work a place this size alone forever." Her English was careful, each word placed precisely, as if it were a fragile thing she had carried a long way. Cole's gaze drifted to the small, unpainted shack that was his home. He saw the single chair at the table through the open doorway, the neat but empty spaces, the profound quiet that lived within its walls. He thought of the long, silent evenings, the sound of his own breathing the only company. He thought of the grave on the low hill behind the house, marked by a simple wooden cross. Lonely was not the word for it. It was a hollowing out, a slow erosion of the soul. He looked back at the girl. She had not flinched under his scrutiny. She simply stood, waiting. It was the most absurd proposal he had ever heard. A madness born of desperation. His own, or her father's, he could not tell. The dog, Shadow, took a step forward, then another, until his nose was just inches from her hand. He sniffed once, then twice, and his tail gave a slow, tentative wag. Cole watched the dog, his last connection to a softer world. The animal was a better judge of character than he was. He looked at the girl's dark, steady eyes, and saw not a schemer, but a survivor. He saw a plea so deep it had no need for tears. He thought of another winter, another silent spring. And the loneliness, which had been a quiet ache, suddenly felt like a sharp, physical pain. "Yes," he said, the word coming out before he had fully formed the thought. The girl's shoulders, which had been held ramrod straight, slumped in a barely perceptible wave of relief. He said you would say yes." Cole gestured with his head toward the house. Inside it was not an invitation, it was a command, blunt and without warmth. Mai picked up her small bundle and followed him, Shadow trailing closely behind her, his tail now moving in a wider, more confident arc. The moment she stepped across the threshold, the silence of the place wrapped around her. It was a physical presence, heavier than the summer heat. The cabin was one room, meticulously clean but stark. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, a single blanket folded neatly upon it. A small, square table stood in the center with one wooden chair. On a rough-hewn shelf, a single tin plate, a single cup, and a single fork and spoon were arranged with military precision. There was no clutter, no sign of hobby or leisure, only the bare essentials of a solitary existence. It was a house built around an absence, a space that held the shape of what was missing. Mai's gaze fell upon a small, faded photograph tacked to the wall near the stove. A woman with a kind smile and Cole's same steady eyes looked out from the image. Beside her, a younger, softer Cole stood, his arm around her, a hint of a smile on his own lips. This, then, was the wound. The house was not merely empty, it was a memorial. Cole walked to the far corner, where a pile of folded blankets sat on a low cot that served as a bench. "You'll sleep there," he said, not looking at her. He moved to the stove, his back a rigid wall of dismissal. "There's work. The chickens need tending. The garden, what's left of it, needs water. I expect you to earn your keep." He spoke as if she were a hired hand he had been forced to take on, not a woman who had been offered to him as a wife. "My understood." The word "a wife" had been a key to open a door, nothing more. The reality would be something else entirely, something she would have to build from the dust of this lonely place. She set her bundle down on the cot. It contained her only other dress, a small pouch of herbs from her mother, and a pair of worn-out slippers. It was the entirety of her world. She looked around the sparse room again, her eyes cataloguing the tasks ahead. The floor needed a good scrubbing, not just a sweeping. The single window was grimy. The scent of stale loneliness clung to the very timbers of the walls. It was a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Shadow padded over to her and nudged her hand with his wet nose, looking up at her with intelligent, brown eyes. She slowly reached out and stroked his head, her fingers sinking into his thick fur. The dog leaned into her touch, letting out a soft sigh. It was the first sign of welcome she had received. Cole glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable as he watched the interaction. He said nothing, turning back to the stove to scoop coffee grounds into the pot, his movements economical and practiced. He was setting a boundary of silence, a territory she was not to cross. Mai accepted it. She had not come here expecting comfort. She had come here for survival, and survival was a language she knew well. She would learn the grammar of this quiet, wounded house, one small task at a time. The next morning, Mai was awake before the sun had fully breached the horizon. Cole was already gone, a faint scent of coffee the only evidence he had been there. A half-full cup sat on the table, a silent offering. She drank it, though she was not used to the bitter taste. It was warm, and that was enough. She started with the small things. She took a bucket and a stiff brush to the cabin floor, scrubbing the pine boards until the clean scent of wood began to overpower the stale air. She washed the single window, letting the pale morning light spill into the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She found his mending basket, a jumble of torn shirts and socks with worn-out heels. Her fingers, nimble and sure, went to work. She did not replace the rough, functional stitches he had made, but worked around them, her own neat, nearly invisible lines of thread reinforcing the fabric, making it stronger. She moved outside, to the chicken coop. The hens clucked nervously at her approach, but she moved slowly, speaking to them in a low, soft murmur of her native tongue. She gathered the eggs, her hands gentle, and refilled their water and feed. Then she turned her attention to the garden. It was a sad, sun-scorched patch of earth. The beans were withered on the vine, the squash plants drooping and yellow. He had called it what's left of it, and she could see why. It was a garden tended by a man with no hope left for it. But Mai saw potential. She saw the deep-rooted herbs that had survived, the stubborn persistence of a few tomato plants. Using a rusty hoe, she began to carefully break up the compacted soil around the struggling plants, her movements rhythmic and patient. She pulled the weeds not with aggression, but with a gentle coaxing, laying them in a neat pile to dry in the sun, where they would become mulch to hold what little moisture remained. She worked through the heat of the day, asking for nothing, stopping only for a drink of water from the well. When Cole returned at dusk, leading his horse, he stopped for a moment, his gaze taking in the yard. The path to the cabin was swept clean. The pile of weeds by the garden was new. He entered the cabin and the first thing he noticed was the light. The clean window made the small space feel larger, brighter. The floorboards were no longer grey with dust but showed the pale grain of the wood. A shirt he had torn on a fence post last week lay folded on his bed, the tear so expertly mended he had to look twice to find it. At the table, 2 places were set. One tin plate, and another she had washed from a dusty stack on a high shelf. A small bowl of scrambled eggs sat in the middle, along with a slice of bread for each of them. He looked at her. She stood by the stove, her hands clasped in front of her her expression neutral. She had taken the smaller portion, he noted. She always would. He sat down without a word and began to eat. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the hollow silence of emptiness, but the watchful silence of two people sharing a space, learning the quiet rhythm of each other's presence. Shadow became Mai's constant companion. In the beginning, he had watched her with the same guarded appraisal as his master, his loyalty absolute and singular. But Mai never pushed. She never commanded him or tried to win his affection with grand gestures. Instead, her kindness was a steady, quiet drizzle. When she worked in the garden, she would speak to him softly, telling him about the plants as if he were a fellow gardener. When she sat outside in the evenings to mend, she would leave a small scrap of jerky from her own meager portion near him, an offering made without expectation. The dog, who had only ever known Cole's gruff, unspoken affection, was slowly disarmed by this different kind of care. He began to anticipate her routines. In the morning, he would wait by the door not for Cole, but for her, whining softly until she emerged to start her day. He would follow her to the chicken coop, sitting patiently as she gathered the eggs, his presence a silent, furry guard against any unseen threat. He started bringing her things, treasures he deemed worthy of her attention, a smooth, grey stone, a fallen bird's feather, once, a very startled field mouse, which he deposited gently at her feet with a proud thump of his tail. Mai had thanked him gravely, scooping up the stunned mouse and releasing it back into the tall grass when the dog was distracted. The true turning point came one afternoon when a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in off the plains. The sky turned a bruised purple-black, and lightning split the heavens, followed by claps of thunder so loud they shook the cabin's very foundation. Shadow, who had a deep-seated fear of the sound, began to pace and whine, his body trembling. Cole was out on the range, checking on a fence line miles away. Mai saw the dog's rising panic. She sat on the floor, pulling a blanket from her cot, and made a soft clicking sound with her tongue. "It's all right, Shanhu," she murmured, using a name from her own language, meaning a mountain tiger. "Just sky noise." The dog hesitated, then crept toward her, his ears flat against his head. He pushed his nose under her hand, still shaking. Mai wrapped the blanket around his broad shoulders and pulled him close, her small frame a surprising anchor against his fear. She did not coddle him, but simply sat with him, her hand resting steadily on his back, a silent, solid presence against the storm's fury. She began to hum a low, tuneless melody from her childhood, a song for chasing away spirits. The dog's trembling slowly subsided. He laid his heavy head in her lap and let out a long, shuddering sigh, his fear receding in the face of her calm. When Cole returned hours later, soaked to the bone, he found them like that. The storm had passed, and the last rays of sun were slanting through the clean window. Mai was asleep, her head leaning against the wall, and the big German shepherd was curled in her lap, utterly content. Cole stood in the doorway, dripping water onto the clean floor, and watched them. He saw how the dog, his fierce, loyal shadow, had given his trust over completely. It was a surrender, an acceptance he himself had not yet been capable of. He felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in his chest, something that was not quite grief and not quite anger. It was the feeling of a lock beginning to rust, of a door long bolted starting to shift on its hinges. Cole began to answer her small acts with his own. He was a man who spoke with his hands, his thoughts expressed in bent steel and planed wood. Words were a foreign currency he had long since stopped trading in. So, he spoke to her in the language he knew. One morning, Mai went to the well and found the old, fraying rope had been replaced with a new one, thick and strong, making the long draw for water smoother and easier on her hands. There was no note, no explanation. The new rope was simply there. A few days later, she found the rickety stool she used to reach the high shelves in the cabin had been mended. The wobbly leg was now firm, a small, almost invisible wooden shim hammered into place. He had done it sometime in the night, silently, while she slept. He started leaving things for her. A small bowl of wild raspberries he'd found while checking his traps appeared on the table one evening. He said nothing, just pushed it toward her side of the table as he sat down. Another time, after a long, hot day of her working to salvage the garden, he left a dipper of the coolest water from the bottom of the well on the porch for her, a silent acknowledgement of her labor. The most significant change happened at the table. For weeks, he had continued his habit of pouring a single cup of coffee in the morning. Mai would drink the leftover half cup he left behind. Then one day, she came into the cabin to find 2 cups on the table. One by his plate, and one by hers. He was at the stove, his back to her, but she saw the slight hesitation in his movement as he poured the coffee, first into his cup, then into hers. It was a small thing, a gesture that cost nothing. But in the silent world of the ranch, it was a profound declaration. It said, "You are here," it said, "I see you." It was an admission of her presence, a doubling of the solitary ritual that had defined his life for so long. Mai felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup. It was an anchor in the quiet, a small point of connection. She looked at his broad back, the tense line of his shoulders, and understood that this was his apology, his gratitude, his conversation. He would not say a thank you for the mended shirts or the salvaged garden or the peace she had brought to his dog. Instead, he would give her a new rope for the well and a second cup for the coffee. And for now, in this house of wounds and silence, it was more than enough. The quiet between them began to change, no longer a void but a space filled with unspoken understanding, a dialogue of silent reciprocation. He was still a fortress, but she was beginning to see the cracks in the stone. One sweltering afternoon, a man on a fine-looking bay horse rode into the yard. He was dressed in town clothes, a clean shirt and a string tie, despite the heat. He had a round, pleasant face and a smile that seemed permanently affixed. He dismounted with a practiced ease, tipping his hat. "Cole, my friend," he said, his voice hearty and smooth. "Been a while. Thought I'd ride out, see how you were faring in this heat." Cole, who had been cleaning a rifle on the porch, nodded slowly, his eyes narrowed. Shadow stood beside him, hackles slightly raised, a low growl barely audible. "Davies," Cole said, his tone flat. It was a statement, not a welcome. Mr. Davies's smile didn't falter. His eyes flicked to the cabin door, where Mai had appeared, wiping her hands on an apron. His smile widened. "Well now, what's this? Don't tell me you finally hired some help." "Smart man. A place this size is too much for 1 inch." Mai felt his gaze sweep over her, assessing and cataloguing. It was not a leering look, but something colder, more calculating. It made the skin on her arms prickle. "She's my wife," Cole said, the words coming out hard and definite. It was the first time he had used the word since her arrival. Davies's eyebrows shot up in feigned surprise. "Wife? Well, congratulations are in order. A quiet wedding, I take it." He chuckled. "Always knew you were a private man, Cole. But a good wife is a blessing. A true blessing." He turned his attention to Mai. "A pleasure to meet you. I'm Frank Davies. I own the adjoining spread. Your husband and I are old neighbors." He spoke to her as if she were a simpleton, his tone overly loud and slow. Mai simply inclined her head, her eyes missing nothing. "I was just saying to Cole," Davies continued, turning back to him, "this drought is a killer. My creek's running low. Yours must be about dry. It's the well that's the real treasure on this land, always has been. A man with a reliable well in these parts is a king." He paused, his gaze lingering on the well pump near the house. "You've kept your paperwork in order, I trust? For the water rights? The county clerk's a stickler these days. New regulations and all." Cole's jaw tightened. "My paperwork is fine." Good, Davies said, his tone breezy. "Just looking out for a neighbor. With a new wife to think of, you can't be too careful. A man has to protect his assets." The word assets hung in the air. He wasn't just talking about the water. Mai watched him, her mind working. She remembered conversations in her father's shop, merchants talking about land grabs, about men who used droughts and legal papers to squeeze out smaller homesteaders. Davies's concern felt rehearsed, his questions too pointed. He asked about the garden, about how many head of cattle Cole was running, about his trips to town. Each question was coated in a layer of friendly interest, but underneath, Mai sensed a sharp, probing edge. He was mapping Cole's life, searching for a weakness. As he was leaving, he smiled at Mai again. "A pleasure. This is a hard life out here. I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into." The words were a warning disguised as a pleasantry. Mai watched him ride away, his back straight, his pleasant smile a mask. She looked at the well, then back at the cabin. Something was wrong. Davies was not a neighbor, he was a vulture, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. The drought tightened its grip like a fist. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky. The creek that bisected Cole's property shrank to a muddy trickle, then disappeared altogether, leaving a cracked, sun-baked scar on the land. The grass in the pasture turned brittle and brown, and the cattle grew thin, their ribs showing. The garden Mai had worked so hard to nurture began to fail. The leaves of the tomato plants curled and blackened at the edges, and the squash shriveled on the vine. The heat was a constant, oppressive weight, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a rain that never came. Cole grew more silent, the lines around his eyes deepening. He spent his days riding the fence lines, his face grim, his movements tight with a barely contained anxiety. The well became their lifeline, the rhythmic squeak of the pump handle the sound of their survival. But even its output seemed to lessen each day, the water they drew tasting more of minerals and earth. It was during this desperate time that Mai's quiet preparations were revealed. Cole had watched, confused, as she'd spent weeks lining several old barrels with a strange, thick clay she had dug from the creek bed before it went dry. She had placed them under the eaves of the cabin and the small barn. He had thought it a strange, pointless task. But the night of the violent thunderstorm, the storm that had terrified Shadow, the barrels had done their work. They had collected gallons of runoff from the roof, water that would have otherwise soaked into the parched ground and evaporated. Now, this water, carefully covered and conserved, was what she used for the chickens and the most resilient of the garden plants. Furthermore, she had built small, shaded canopies over the hardiest vegetables using old burlap sacks, shielding them from the worst of the afternoon sun. She had mulched their roots not just with weeds, but with every scrap of organic matter she could find, creating a thick layer that held the moisture in the soil. She rationed their drinking water with a discipline that bordered on severe. Every drop was measured, every cup accounted for. She washed their plates with a small basin of water that was then used for the herbs by the door. Nothing was wasted. One evening, Cole came back to the cabin, defeated. "I'll have to sell off half the herd," he said, his voice flat with despair. "There's not enough water to keep them. I'll be lucky to get half what they're worth." He slumped into his chair, the weight of the ranch pressing down on him. Mai placed a cup of water in front of him. It was from the well, their precious drinking supply. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "we will dig." He looked at her, uncomprehending. "Dig where?" "The ground is like iron, the place where the creek bends," she explained. "Where the willows grow. The roots go deep. The water is not gone. It is just hiding." He stared at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes. It was a mad idea, born of desperation. But he looked at the surviving plants in her garden, at the water barrels, at the way she had quietly prepared for a catastrophe he had only reacted to. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years, hope. They began to dig at dawn. The spot Mai had chosen was a low-lying curve in the dry creek bed, shaded by a cluster of stubborn willows. The ground was hard, but not the baked clay of the open plains. Here, it was sandy and damp a few inches down. Cole worked with the shovel, his powerful shoulders driving the blade into the earth, while Mai cleared the loose dirt with a bucket. Shadow lay under a willow, watching them, panting in the growing heat. For hours, they worked in a shared, rhythmic silence. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them. Sweat soaked through Cole's shirt and plastered the loose strands of hair to Mai's temples. The hole grew deeper. A foot. 2 feet. The soil grew darker, cooler, smelling of damp earth and roots. Cole's initial skepticism had long since evaporated, replaced by a grim determination. He was trusting her, not just her knowledge, but her instinct. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice raspy as he paused to wipe his brow. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on the hole they were creating. Mai stopped, her hands resting on the edge of the pit. "In my village, the river was a trickster. It would come in a flood, and then for months, it would vanish. The old women, they taught us to read the land. To look for the signs. The deep-rooted trees, the way the ground settles. They taught us where the water waits." She spoke of her home matter-of-factly, without sentimentality. But Cole heard the story beneath the words. He heard the hardship that had forged her knowledge, the scarcity that had taught her to see what others overlooked. "Your father," Cole said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. "Why did he send you?" Mai was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. "He is a good man," she said softly. "But he is not a lucky one. The railroad came, but it bypassed our town. The merchants left. My brothers went east to find work on the lines. There were debts. To a man who was not kind." She did not need to elaborate. Cole understood the kind of debts that could only be paid in impossible ways. "He heard about you from a trader," she continued. "A man who had lost his wife. A man with good land and a strong back, but a hollow house. My father said your loneliness was a wound as deep as our poverty. He hoped one could heal the other." Cole stopped digging. He leaned on the shovel, looking at this small, determined woman. He had seen her as a bargain, a solution to a problem. But she was not a solution. She was a person, with a history of her own wounds, her own losses. She had been sent to save her family, just as he was now trying to save his ranch. Their solitudes were not the same, but they rhymed. Just then, his shovel hit something different. Not rock, but a thick, sucking mud. A dark, wet patch began to spread at the bottom of the hole. Water. It wasn't a spring, but a slow, steady seep, the hidden reservoir of the underground creek. It was enough. It was everything. He looked at Mai, and for the first time, his gaze held no walls, no guards. It held a raw, unguarded gratitude that was more potent than any spoken word. The discovery of the seep water changed the atmosphere on the ranch. It was not a solution to the drought, but a reprieve, a fighting chance. The cattle now had enough to drink. The most vital parts of the garden could be saved. The oppressive weight of despair lifted, replaced by the grim focus of survival. But their small victory did not go unnoticed. A week later, Frank Davies returned. This time, he was not alone. He was accompanied by the county sheriff, a portly man with a weary expression. Davies's smile was gone, replaced by a look of solemn, regretful duty. "Cole," he said, his voice laced with false sympathy. "I'm sorry to do this." Truly, he held out a piece of paper. "This is a legal notice. My lawyers uncovered it when I was reviewing my own deeds. It seems my father purchased the primary water rights to this entire section, including your well, back in '72. The paperwork was filed incorrectly, but it's been rectified. The well is legally mine." Cole took the paper, his face turning to stone as he read the dense legal text. It looked official, stamped and signed. A cold dread washed over him. The well was the heart of the ranch. Without it, the land was worthless. "This is fraud," Cole said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your father never bought any rights from mine. It's all there in black and white," Davies said smoothly. "The clerk's office has the original on file. The sheriff is here to ensure the transfer of property is peaceful." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Just doing my job, Cole. The paper looks legal." "My hands are tied." Davies's gaze then fell upon the barrels of rainwater and the new watering hole at the creek. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He had expected to find a man on his knees, completely broken by the drought. He had not expected this resilience. He had not accounted for Mai. "Of course," Davies continued, his voice turning magnanimous, "I'm a reasonable man. I have no desire to see a neighbor, an old friend, cast out. I will allow you and your wife to stay on as tenants. You can work the land for me. A small percentage of the yield will be sufficient for rent. It was the final move in his game. Not just to take the land, but to humiliate Cole, to make him a servant on the very ground his family had bled for. The offer was a calculated cruelty, designed to break his spirit completely. Mai, who had been standing silently by the door, watched Davies's face. She saw the smug certainty in his eyes, the satisfaction of a predator closing in on its prey. She looked at the document in Cole's hand. She remembered the way Davies had talked about the county clerk, the new regulations. It all felt too convenient. Her mind went back to her father's shop, to the different kinds of paper and ink he used for his ledgers. She looked again at the document Cole was holding. The paper was crisp, the ink a uniform, solid black. It looked too perfect. An idea, sharp and clear, formed in her mind. She said nothing, but a quiet resolve settled over her. This fight was not over. Davies had miscalculated. He saw a lonely man and a foreign girl. He did not see the rancher's iron will, and he did not see the quiet, observant woman who had learned to survive by noticing the things others missed. That night, a heavy quiet fell over the cabin. It was not the companionable silence of recent weeks, but the tense, brittle silence of impending loss. Cole sat at the table, the legal notice spread before him, staring at it as if he could will it to be false. He had been defeated not by the land or the sky, but by a piece of paper. He felt a familiar, crushing weight, the same he had felt when he buried his first wife, Sarah. The feeling of being powerless against a cruel turn of fate. Mai watched him, her heart aching for the pain he could not show. His bag was packed. She knew what it meant. It was the bag he kept ready after Sarah's death, the one he'd nearly used to abandon the ranch before something had made him stay. Now it was out again, a symbol of his surrender. She waited until the moon was high, until his breathing had evened out into the troubled sleep of the defeated. Then, she moved. Silently, she lit a small lamp, keeping the flame low. She went to a dusty wooden chest in the corner, one she had never seen Cole open. It was where he kept Sarah's things. With a deep breath, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled amongst folded linens and a pressed wedding dress, was a small, leather-bound book. A diary. Beside it was a stack of old papers tied with a ribbon, letters, receipts, and the original deed to the ranch, signed by Cole's father. Her hands trembled as she took the deed and one of Sarah's letters, written just a year before she died. She brought them to the table, placing them beside Davies's notice. By the lamplight, the difference was stark. The ink on the old deed and the letter was faded, a brownish black, and it had bled slightly into the fibers of the aged, yellowed paper. Davies's document, by contrast, was written on paper that was artificially aged, but the ink was a sharp, modern black. It sat on top of the paper, uniform and crisp, the way ink from a newfangled fountain pen did, not the iron gall ink used a decade ago. It was the wrong ink. Davies, in his haste to create a convincing forgery, had overlooked a small, crucial detail. Mai then went to her own small bundle. From it, she took the pouch of herbs from her mother. She ground a specific root into a fine powder, mixing it with a little water to create a paste. She carefully applied a tiny amount to the corner of the signature on Davies's document. She waited, her heart pounding. Slowly, the black ink began to change, a faint bluish halo appearing around the edges. It was a chemical reaction she knew from her father's work with dyes. The ink was new. The next morning, Davies arrived with the sheriff and 2 hired men to enforce the eviction. "Cole, I'm sorry it's come to this," he said, his voice dripping with false regret. Cole stood on the porch, his face a grim mask, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. But before he could speak, Mai stepped forward. She held the 3 documents in her hand. "This paper is a lie," she said, her voice clear and steady. She addressed the sheriff. "Look at the ink. This is the real deed. This is a letter from 10 years ago. The ink is old. Faded. This, she held up Davies's forgery, is new ink. It pretends to be old. Davies scoffed. Nonsense. It's a legal document, is it? My said. She pointed to the corner she had treated. This ink changes color with a simple route. Old ink does not. The sheriff, intrigued despite himself, leaned in for a closer look. He saw the faint blue halo. He looked from the forgery to the authentic deed, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the truth of what she was saying. Just then, Cole stepped forward to stand beside my. He didn't look at Davies. He looked at the sheriff. My wife is telling the truth. The sight of them standing together, the broken rancher and the quiet immigrant girl, a united front of plain dignity, was more powerful than any weapon. The sheriff looked at Davies, whose face had gone pale, his confident smirk finally gone. The lie had been exposed, not with violence, but with quiet truth. Frank, the sheriff said, his voice hard. You've got a lot of explaining to do. Davies deflated, his bluff called, his scheme dissolving into the hot prairie air. He was finally seen for what he was. In the aftermath, the silence that returned to the ranch was different yet again. It was a silence of peace, of a battle won and a storm weathered. Davies was gone, his reputation in the county shattered by the quiet evidence of a forged document. The sheriff had made it clear he would not be troubling them again. The rains eventually came, a soft, steady drizzle at first, then a ground-soaking downpour that washed the dust from the air and turned the brown pastures to a vibrant green. The creek began to flow, and the well water rose. The land, like the people on it, began to heal. One evening, Cole and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Shadow lay at their feet, his head resting on my slippers. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The comfortable quiet was all they needed. Then Cole turned to her. The harsh lines on his face had softened. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a clear, steady warmth. The bag, he said, his voice quiet. I put it away. Smile looked at him, and her heart gave a small, joyful leap. The packed bag, his symbol of readiness to flee, was gone. It was a promise. It was his way of saying he was home to stay. You saved this place, he continued, finally saying her name. It sounded right in the twilight air. No, she said softly, looking out at the land that was now as much hers as it was his. We saved it. He reached out and took her hand. His was calloused and rough from work, hers was small and stained with garden soil. They fit together perfectly. He didn't need to say more. The shared silence, the 2 cups on the table, the mended tools, the put-away bag, and now, his hand holding hers, it all said what the word wife had only promised. It said belonging. It said partnership. It said love, grown slowly and quietly in the hard soil of a lonely ranch. The next morning, Mai unpacked her own small bundle for the first time. She placed her mother's pouch of herbs on the shelf and put on her other dress. She was no longer a visitor waiting to be sent away. She was home. Cole came in from the morning chores and stopped in the doorway. He saw her standing in the center of the room, no longer lost in a tattered dress but rooted in the space belonging to it. He walked to the table and set 2 plates down for breakfast. He looked at her, a slow, real smile finally reaching his eyes. My father said you needed a wife, she had whispered on that first day, a desperate bargain in the dust. Now, standing in the warm light of the cabin, she knew the truth. He hadn't needed a wife. He had needed her. Thank you for watching.